Yeah, well, of course, within the military, there's a lot of technological innovation, but increasingly there's been a lot of focus on the development of autonomous systems and the use of artificial intelligence to control weapon systems. And this allows autonomous navigation and things like that, which has many applications like cargo, delivery, and things like that. But this can also be paired with weapon systems. And so now we're starting to see the emergence of systems that are not just the kind of long range weapon systems we've seen with drones and unmanned aerial vehicles that are controlled by humans at a great distance, but the possibility to really replace that human control with software. And this raises a whole host of ethical and legal questions about the killing of people in war with algorithms and computer programs making the decisions of what constitutes a target and whether to use lethal force against that target. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to think about what how you define an autonomous weapon system, but we're really following the definition that's been suggested by the International Committee for the Red Cross, which says that when you have autonomy in the critical functions of target selection and target engagement or firing of a weapon, that constitutes an autonomous weapon. So you could say, in order to control those weapons, if you believe, like I do, that they're unethical and they should be made illegal, then you would say, okay, no autonomous weapons, so nothing that has autonomous targeting and firing capability. But the other way to sort of think about it is, well, what constitutes that kind of autonomy is to think sort of the negative, like don't have autonomous weapons, think of the positive sort of requirement that any weapon system that you deploy has meaningful human control over target selection and engagement of targets. And that's really a requirement that there's a human being who's a responsible legal and moral agent who understands what that system is going to do, what it's targeting, and that what it is targeting is a legal and militarily necessity, and has a military necessity in targeting that before it fires. And that it's done for every attack. So you don't want weapons that are out roaming around looking for targets, selecting those targets on their own, using software and sensors, and then engaging those targets without any humans really supervising them or understanding the context in which they're operating. And that just, apart from common sense, it challenges a lot of the legal notions of responsibility for commanders who would deploy such a system. They may have certain kinds of guarantees that a system is supposed to do something, but to what extent do they really understand how that system works and what it's actually going to do in that particular context when these become incredibly complicated, long-range, long-term kinds of autonomous missions? Yeah, so the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots has been working at the UN in multiple fora on this issue for about since 2012 and 2013. We started at the Human Rights Council. Now we're at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or the CCW, which has its role to control conventional weapons systems. And there's been a series of meetings and discussions in that context about adding an additional protocol, and so we're hoping that those are successful. This summer, they're moving to a more formal group of governmental experts meeting after a series of three informal expert meetings over the last 3 years. And in that regard, they move by consensus. So all of the countries who are party to that treaty, which is 128, I think, countries now, who are party to the CCW, must all assent to any new protocol. So I think there's been a lively discussion, and of course, China and Russia and the U.S. as major military powers have had a large voice in that. We've also heard from the EU, Germany, Japan, many countries have made statements. We've also heard many countries, I think there's now 14 countries that have spoken out in support of a ban explicitly. Other countries that have spoken in terms of being willing to consider such a protocol. So certainly any single country can undermine it. I think politically the interest in any kinds of arms control negotiation like this is that it's in the mutual interest of all countries that no countries acquire this kind of technology. Certainly certain countries who are more advanced think they will acquire it first and they'll be able to take advantage of that, and that makes it more difficult to have these kinds of negotiations, I think. So I think there's different ways to frame ethical questions and problems. I think the best way to frame a discussion of ethics, especially at an international arms control level, is to think about human rights and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that the UN has also adopted, which codifies a right to life and also a right to human dignity. And those rights are inviolable. So under the international laws of armed conflict, it is permissible to kill. But that killing is always done into the service of a higher sort of right, which is a right to self-defense and the preservation of other lives. In the case of autonomous weapons, though, and the requirement really for overriding one person's rights over another in terms of the right to life, is that there's a judgment that it's both necessary and legal and morally justified to do so. Right. So if you fail to provide that kind of judgment and justification for killing, then that's considered summary, arbitrary, or extrajudicial execution. Right. And there's a special rapporteur in the Human Rights Council who actually initiated the discussions there on this topic, who gave a special report on autonomous weapons, Christoph Heinz. And so the concern is that these systems, because they are not moral agents, they're not legal agents, if they make mistakes, they're not responsible for those mistakes, they're just machines. And the humans who operate them may not fully understand how they work in such a way that they could be held responsible. And so there's this sort of accountability gap that emerges, and that's a huge concern about how do you regulate these systems going forward. And in general, that everybody that they would kill would potentially be arbitrary in a more formal or technical sense. And so that's certainly a situation that you want to avoid. And I think, again, that's where meaningful human control comes back into play, that if you have a requirement for that, you can ensure that whenever anybody is killed in armed conflict, there is somebody who's making a judgment that there's a moral and legal justification for that killing. There's a lot of discussion, of course, and when the press covers our campaign, they always like to stick the little Terminator image on the articles. So it's a question we get a lot, though our real concern is with protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict, and the real serious threats that these kinds of autonomous weapons would pose to them, as well as the possibility that these kinds of weapons could fall in the hands of dictators who would use them against their own people, even when their own military and police forces would refuse to deploy force against the civilian population, or by terrorists and rogue states and non-state actors who would use them to do great harm to civilian populations. I think ultimately, whether robots are going to take over the world, I think if they're ever that sophisticated, it's going to be a long way off. In the near term, we really have to worry about stupid robots, not really the super smart robots, but robots that we think are more capable than they are, and we give them more responsibility than they should have, and that it actually then allows humans to delegate and derogate their own responsibilities for ensuring the protection of civilians in armed conflict and other kinds of ethical considerations like that. There's a question of whether the technology itself could meet the requirements of international humanitarian law for the use of force in armed conflict. And there's really three requirements there. So there's one is the principle of distinction, which is to distinguish combatants from civilians. And that's incredibly challenging from a technical perspective. Computer vision, however, has made brilliant strides in the last few years. I think at some point in the future that might be possible, but even then, it's challenging because it's not simply a visual distinction. So in many cases, you might be able to distinguish the uniforms of two different militaries, for instance. But in many cases, you have non-uniformed partisans or guerrillas or insurgents who are not wearing uniforms. And just because they are carrying weapons doesn't necessarily mean that they are armed combatants. They could be a militia or police force. They could be defending their own homes or farms. It could be ceremonial weapons. It could be children carrying weapons. It could be farmers carrying farm implements that look like weapons. So there's a lot of, I think, technical challenges in that regard, but it's the kind of thing that computers could be good at and could be better at than humans at some point in the near future. However, when you get to questions of proportionality, which is how much force is justified in a given conflict, or if I'm going to destroy this ammunition depot that's next to a school or a church, how valuable does that military target need to be relative to the risk posed to the civilians, the children and the patients in the hospital in that case? And those are value judgments. And you can assign arbitrary numbers, and a computer can calculate the equation based on that, but it doesn't really understand any of those values, the value of a human life and how to weigh the value of a human life against the value of a military objective. It just doesn't understand that. It's part of a human context and strategy. And so the military necessity and proportionality, I think, are really human judgments, and that we want humans who are responsible for making those judgments and not delegating that to a machine. And I don't see machines really doing that effectively in the same way that humans do in any time in the near future.